What can you tell us about this list that the Council on Foreign Relations puts out?
I find it intriguing and interesting. President Obama's visit in 2014 to the Baltic states, he didn't even get the capital of the country correct in his speech. I find it hard to believe if the White House isn't that focused when they're doing a visit of a head of state to another nation, that the Council on Foreign Relations is right, that this is the first urgent issue for the United States.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I guess there are two different ways that you could take that statement. You said that Obama wasn't able to pronounce correctly. I guess three ways. That Obama wasn't able to pronounce the name of whatever city that he was in. You mentioned maybe they weren't that focused. I don't know. Maybe they weren't. Maybe they were also, that's just the level where they're at. They just don't know geography. Or maybe Obama just got it wrong. I don't know. But
well, it wasn't that he mispronounced the city. He named the wrong city. He talked about the issue of the tower in one of the Baltic states, and it was the wrong country and the wrong capital. And he also, in the middle of his speech, lauded an organization that had its roots in Nazism. And it was just a speech that the audience gasped when they heard it. But the point I'm making is if this is a priority, red-hot issue for the United States, they would do a little better preparatory work for his visit to the Baltic states.
No, I definitely agree with you there. And it's also interesting. You talked about a head of America, the president of America, traveling to the Baltic states. And in general, there's definitely something going on there because we see a lot of different soldiers not from there, from America, from Canada, from various Western European countries, in addition to other countries around the world, slowly but surely being stationed there. And yet, it made this list, one of the first things there is a potential armed conflict between Russia and NATO. Although it's a moderate probability, it really seems as if, Russia's still in its own country, and yet a lot of other soldiers are gathering there. So, why would this be on this list, and especially such a high place?
Yeah, that's what's far-fetched to me from the Russian perspective. It's far-fetched. I mean, now later on their list, they talk about Crimea. Well, there is activity in Crimea, Ukraine. There's possible conflict there, although I keep pointing out to my American friends that the Crimea was Russian before America was America. So it's not the same thing. Russia establishing itself in its own territory in the Crimea, that's not the same thing as reconstituting the former Soviet Union, as Americans like to say is happening. So it's inaccurate, in my opinion, and that's troubling. I wonder if someone has an agenda, if there's some corporate agenda or something that's driving this report, or if it's just genuine ignorance of the area.
Interesting. All right. Well, some are pointing out that if you dig into the reasons of the threats that have been listed, some of them are directly or indirectly caused by the U.S. itself. And we kind of just hinted at that when we talked about some of the U.S. soldiers being stationed halfway around the world inside of the Baltic countries. If they weren't there, arguably there would be no reason for Russia and America to fight if indeed, Russia did invade the Baltic countries, let's say. So what's going on here?
Well, that's true. There are some people in the United States who study this and focus on it, and they see it clearly. Sevastopol is an example. They point out that how would you feel if Russian ships were arriving at the port of Miami and coming in and out of Miami? How would you feel? They point out that a third, is my understanding, and publicly that's discussed, that a third of Russia's nuclear deterrent is submarine-based. So you're virtually asking Russia to give up any defense that it could muster for itself if you're saying that they don't have rights to Sevastopol and they don't have rights to the Crimea. So it's very troubling. What's troubling for me and for Americans who study this is the ignorance of the American public, the general public, and sometimes ignorance can lead to unnecessary confrontation and misunderstanding and war, and you find out after the fact, oops, we were wrong about that. We misunderstood that. So that's troubling. To defend America, this has been our mindset for a long time. It's just like certain ideas are ingrained in the Russian DNA, Americans have been protected by these two oceans, the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, and we're very inbred and introspective, and we're not as knowledgeable about other parts of the world as many other nations are. And that blissful ignorance has been at times a blessing, but it can be a curse, too.
With that said, there are some other possible conflicts in 2017 here. And again, some of them are a little strange. I mean, we have here the intensification of the civil war in Syria resulting from an increased external support from warring parties, including military intervention by outside powers. And, if this is one of the top-tier conflicts in 2017 that CFR has put out, it's again somewhat suspect considering that I believe, the U.S. has been, or directly or indirectly, or at least there's talk about it, and I think it just passed in the House, the direct support for some of these terrorist groups that are willing to, support, or they're willing to give bigger and better weapons to them. So it shouldn't come as a shock if there is more conflict in Syria instead of less, right?
That's correct, but America's divided on that. And it appears from the last election, it's almost divided evenly on that. There's a small percentage of Americans who follow the issue and understand the issue, and they drive the discussion. But there's no question that Hillary Clinton, for example, the decisions she made during the period of the Arab Spring helped start ISIS. I mean, that was the charge that Trump made. It was galling for Americans to look on television and see American tanks roaming across the Middle East with ISIS flags hanging from them. How did that happen? Some Americans began to ask. And when they learned, they were astounded. These were the rebels that we were supporting and giving hardware to, that were fighting Assad. So it's a real dilemma. The Americans who are upset at Assad and upset at Russia for defending and helping Assad regain control of his country, those Americans are frustrated. They know that among the rebels are terrorists, yet the corporate media who supports that view doesn't share the information. I mean, I just saw the news again last night, and you can see it night after night here in the United States, showing the embattled rebels, but not identifying who they are, what their agenda is, who makes up their leadership. That's completely untold to the American people.
You pointed out an interesting part there, and then I my firm belief is that the great majority of people around the world don't want war. They basically want the same thing. They want to watch their kids get old. They want to have some food on the table, and in their leisure time, they'd like to entertain themselves in some manner. But with that said, it is one of the duties of leaderships around the world to try to convince the public to put all of that aside and to march off, and for their sons to march off and die in foreign countries. And so that's the troubling aspect of it. I know that many people want the good, but you mentioned the mainstream media selling the bad packaged as good, and that's really the troubling aspect of it.
It's driven by dollars. It's driven by money, which is the answer to most questions. But there are companies that make tremendous amounts of money off of the development and research and production of weapons. It's one of America's last industries, and that's here, that's home-based, and it creates a lot of jobs, and those big corporations are the ones that advertise on television and in the newspapers. They finance the corporate media, and so there's this symbiotic relationship that exists. Now, I will say Donald Trump has kind of signaled a new era. Boeing, for example, announced their new $10 billion Air Force One, appealing to Trump's ego. You're going to have the best airplane ever, not immediately for you, but it's on its way. And Trump shot it down. Here was a company, Boeing, that had given $1 million to the Clinton Foundation, and they had given $2 million to the State Department for help with the Olympics, even though the State Department had said that would be limited to $1 million. They got help from Hillary Clinton. All of their top executives had given the maximum donations to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, and so she's supposed to win and pay them back by giving them these lucrative government contracts. But guess what? She didn't win. So here's Donald Trump, and he's saying to Boeing, there's a new way of doing business. You want government money, you come in with a bid that's good and it's on time, and you can get government money for your projects. but the old way of doing business is over. I'm rich. I don't need your money. You can't give me money to get my decision. And that was stunning for Boeing. But it does represent perhaps an opening for those in America who are tired of seeing the companies drive this issue.
Going back to the report from the CFR, has downgraded some ongoing conflicts to being lesser priorities in 2017. They include political instability in the European Union, stemming from the refugee crisis, and the fracturing of Iraq caused by sectarian violence and the Islamic State. So does this mean that these conflicts don't pose significant threats anymore, or they're just maybe not that important to the CFR anymore?
Well, they're obviously, based on their positioning, less important to the CFR. I don't know if that reflects how the American people feel, but the CFR marches to its own drummers. It has its own agenda, its own tradition, and people who work within its think tank. And in recent years, many feel they've been influencing each other.
What would you list as the top threats to watch out for in 2017?
Well, I agree with the new president that the corruption in the United States is our biggest problem. I believe it's reached the point that it's a threat to our survival as a people. We've always had corruption. There always will be corruption. It's not a phenomena that can be blamed on a particular ideology. It's human nature. But we haven't seen it this bad since the Gilded Age. It's really become bad. University of California, Berkeley study shows that the poor got poor and the rich got richer under Barack Obama at an astounding rate. Obama himself didn't like it, was embarrassed by it, but it's just an enormous transfer of wealth to a very tiny percentage of people, and it will be hard to break. But it appears, ironically, that a very wealthy man who's benefited from that system is ready to take it on and try to bust it up. I think that's the greatest threat.